We are Area 51 Coffee Company. Coffee for regular humans and coffee with twice the caffeine of a typical cup with a buzz that's out of this world. Coffee connoisseurs from across the galaxy seek out our smooth brew with a hint of sweetness in a perfect roast. Area51coffeeco.com. You will also be assimilated with our Area 51 merchandise. We are invading Earth one cup at a time. We are Area 51 Coffee Company. Area51coffeeco.com.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic threw their plans against us.
Prior to your abduction, did you believe in UFOs or any sort of alien life form?
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
All right, welcome to All Things Unexplained. I am Dr. Mounce. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. We are live on Twitter and LinkedIn and YouTube. Please chime in on the comments and let us hear from you. If you have any questions for our special guest tonight, please put them in all caps because that will really help me out, help me get to them, because I'm by myself tonight. No solo, no CJ, no Smitty. They couldn't join me tonight. Please make sure to subscribe if you're on YouTube, especially. Follow us on Twitter, comment, like, and share. It really helps us defeat the evil algorithms that are trying to prevent disclosure. And shout out to our listeners that are already in the chat, and some of you have been there for quite a while. I want to kind of send some shout outs out here to Jax, who says, hey, welcome. And Jax has been here for quite a while waiting on our special guest tonight, and well before the start time. And special shout out to Eli. Are you able to ask questions? Absolutely. Eli, you definitely can. And Jax is here with us tonight from Liverpool. We have a lot of fans in the UK and Australia, so I expect our Australian friends to jump in tonight as well. Again, welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Mounce. I'm an author. I have some books on Amazon. I'm a narrator. I have some books on Audible. I'm a professor. And obviously, I'm here with you tonight to talk about UFOs. And I want to welcome our special guest tonight, Dr. Kevin Knuth. And I'm going to give him a little introduction here. We're joined by Dr. Kevin Knuth, a renowned physicist and researcher. You might recognize him from his appearances on shows like Encounters and A Tear in the Sky, where he explored mysteries beyond our understanding. Kevin is also a key figure in UAPX, the organization dedicated to unraveling the secrets of unidentified aerial phenomenon. Please, everybody put your hands together and welcome Dr. Kevin Knuth to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm impressed that people are listening in the UK and Australia. The people in the UK are up really late, and I guess the people from Australia are up really early. So and it's almost the same at this point.
Well, they're quite dedicated. Eli says he is sub. Thank you so much for that. They're quite dedicated, and our listeners in Australia, some of them actually run, and I really appreciate this, and this reminds me of your organization, UAPX, and this is why I tell people a lot, Dr. Knuth, that, we can go out there and collect data ourselves. We don't have to depend on these government organizations, but we have listeners in Australia that operate a night webcam, and they just let it show the sky, stream the sky all night long on YouTube, and they spot some amazing things. Of course, they're really out there in the middle of nowhere with no light pollution in the outback or somewhere in Australia. Hopefully they'll chime in tonight. And we're here tonight to get Dr. Knuth's reaction to the AARO report, the recent AARO report, along with a few other things. That AARO, for those that don't know, stands for, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Knuth, the All Domain Anomalous Resolution Office, the latest in acronyms. One thing I can't figure out, Dr. Knuth, is if everything is just weather balloons and, mundane phenomena, why do we even need an all-domain anomalous resolution office?
That's a big hint, isn't it? It's a big hint that they're not telling you everything that they're not talking about everything they should be talking about. It's all domain because these things are seen in the oceans too. And there recently was a report, I think it was a Seoul Foundation white paper put off by Admiral Gallaudet on unidentified submerged objects and how they are very much neglected. And I would agree with that.
That's a good point. I hope to get touch back and circle back with you later on USOs, which I know you talked about at the Seoul Foundation. So I'm hoping we'll circle back there at the end of the show tonight. And again, we're talking to Dr. Kevin Knuth, physicist. Thanks so much. He's joining us for the second time, everybody, to talk about the AARO report. And if you're not familiar with the AARO report, listeners, this has been my favorite headline for what the AARO report is and its significance. Let me see if I can pull this headline up. Where are you? There you are. Headline. No proof the U.S. government knows anything about UFOs, says the U.S. government. A Pentagon report claims no U.S. government investigation has any proof of extraterrestrial technology, but that's exactly, of course, what they would say by Owen Bellwood. So I really like that. The government puts out a report, they don't know anything about the UFOs, says the government.
I find it interesting that the title of that I find interesting. So if there's no proof that the U.S. government knows anything about UFOs, then why even look to them for answers, right?
Yeah, that's a good question because, all I can figure, they really want us to look to the government for answers for everything.
Right. We keep looking to the U.S. government for answers, yet from what they tell us, there's no proof that they know anything. So I think, and I think that the AARO report would really does confirm that to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to dig into that. And one thing that's apparent to me, and I was talking about this with some friends today, is organizations like AARO, they really just completely ignore scientists like yourself and others who are researching the topic. If it isn't somebody within their spectrum that has something to say about it, they really don't put it out there or acknowledge that. And I know that has to be frustrating to you.
Yeah, well, that's a big problem. You should take advantage of all the resources available, and they clearly don't. They want a particular group of particular cadre of people with only certain amounts of expertise and certain reach to handle these things. And that was true of the NASA panel too. NASA panel, I was surprised by it because they gathered together, a bunch of experts, but none of them were current or former NASA people who studied UAPs. None of them had ever studied UAPs before. Where I'm a former NASA employee, I study UAPs. I know at least 6 or 7 other current and former NASA people who have studied UAPs. Any one of them would have been great to have on that panel. They could have been a valuable resource. And in fact, when NASA formed its panel, several of us contacted each other and asked, were you asked to be on the panel? Were you? And we were all rather surprised that we weren't. And there was some discussion as to whether we should write some kind of editorial pointing out that none of us were asked. None of our expertise was tapped. Why is that? That's a good question.
That is a good question. And it really just makes you wonder. We're joined by Dr. Kevin Knuth tonight to talk about the latest AARO report. And I'm going to pull up some slides here to talk about with you, Dr. Knuth. And let me see. the 2024 AARO report on the historical record of the U.S. government involvement with unidentified anomalous phenomenon, UAP. One thing I love that you said at the Seoul conference, you said, I'm going to talk about them as UFOs. I'm going to call them UFOs because I'm interested in the objects. I'm not necessarily interested in anomalous phenomenon. But AARO really had one major conclusion, which a lot of people found disappointing. AARO concluded there is no evidence UFOs are off-world technology or a part of a classified program that had not been properly reported to Congress. Most sightings were misidentification of ordinary objects and phenomena. And matter of fact, they even, added fuel to the fire and said, if we had more data on some of these cases, they probably would have been ordinary objects as well. What's your reaction to that, Dr.
Yeah,
Knuth?
can you put that back up? Because I
Absolutely.
think that that's important to walk through. So first, there's no evidence that UFOs are off-world technology. Well, that is not surprising for a few reasons. First, what would it take to prove that it was off-world? To prove that something's extraterrestrial is quite a high bar. You'd have to prove that it comes from another planet, and that's difficult to do. Now, off-world technology, well, even Congress has changed their terminology. They don't use the term extraterrestrial anymore. They use the term non-human. And for good reason, because all evidence that we have seen points to the fact that whoever these peoples are who make these objects or use these objects they live here on Earth. The reaction time is way too fast to come from anywhere else. Even Carl Sagan pointed out, and this was his argument against UFOs being interstellar craft, was that he had a hard time believing that you had interstellar spacecraft arriving at Earth every other week. And I would totally agree with that. Would be hard to believe, but I would also grab him by the shoulders and say, all right, Carl, you've almost got it. Go one step further. They're not coming from another star system. Yes, they live here. That's the obvious thing, and I think that's the problem. Now, we at UAPX had been, we briefed AARO at one point in last year in February, a little more than a year ago. We've briefed several other three-letter government organizations, and we briefed the House Armed Services Committee, and every single one of those briefings, we were asked the question, what are your capabilities for observing underwater? That was asked every time, and clearly, again, the issue of unidentified submerged objects is a big deal, and clearly related to the UFO problem. So, so that's an important thing that's missing from this report. Of course, the first point here, most sightings were the result of misidentification of ordinary objects and phenomena. That is absolutely true. People who studied UFOs have been saying that for years. It's the 3%, the residual that you can't explain that's interesting. And their last statement is rather silly. Although many UAP reports remain unsolved, AARO assesses that if additional quality data were available, most could be identified as being prosaic, basically. So how can they assess that if they don't have enough data? You can't assess that without data, and that's the whole point of collecting data. So that last statement's really pretty ridiculous.
I think so too. It's a really opinionated statement for such a report. It's almost like they're going out of their way to bat down any interest in the anomalous part.
This whole report is almost like the authors have a chip on their shoulder and are going after the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And that in itself is unscientific. You don't go after a hypothesis. What you do is you try to figure out what things are. You try to rule out hypotheses. Now, if they can rule out a extraterrestrial hypothesis, great, but you're not going to rule it out this way. So this is, the whole approach there is unscientific in the first place. And this is supposed to be a historical report. of the government's involvement with UAPs. And
Right,
even in that from that perspective, it's lacking.
Oh yeah, failed miserably. And we're going to talk about some of the errors in the AARO report. And next, the AARO report, just based off these conclusions, it just left a whole lot of unanswered questions that I was hoping you could address with us tonight, Dr. Knuth. And yes, I have to. Listener Pepito GTO says AARO lies. Well, they certainly.
Yeah, there's a good bit of that going on. It appears there's a good bit of dishonesty still, and it's disconcerting, especially because we're in a situation here in the U.S. now where we have a great mistrust of our government, and if you're worried about mistrust, the first thing to do is be truthful, and be obviously truthful, and that's not happening here.
Oh, yeah, I believe it was Orwell in 1984 that said the greatest enemy of a government is an independent, free-thinking society, one that questions things and seeks knowledge and information. So, yeah, it kind of seems like that's what AARO really is counting on, is folks just to, sit back and go to work. It's kind of like that movie we love here at All Things Unexplained, They Live, with Rowdy Roddy Piper. It was way ahead of its time. They just want people to comply and wake up and go to work and sleep, get 8 hours of sleep and that sort of thing, and just keep following the rules. So I'm going to talk about some unanswered questions now that this left open. This comes from an article in Wired by Graf. So these are just some really open-ended questions that AARO left on the vine for us. And Dr. Knuth, what do you think about this? If these are not anomalous situations, which they don't talk about here, could it be secret tech from foreign nations or secret U.S. tech?
Right. Again, here in this whole topic, there's a lot to unpack. First, UAP and even UFOs are not going to be just one thing. They're a class of objects. And so it's not clear that, some of them are going to be weather balloons, right? Some of them are birds. Some of them are drones. And some of them very possibly are secret U.S. tech. In fact, we know that this is the case in some cases. Some of the objects that had been reported in the 60s were described as match up with a U-2 spy plane. Not surprising. And some of them could easily be foreign tech. And some of them still could be non-human craft. That doesn't rule that out. So just having a bunch of CIA projects that happen to match a bunch of UFO sightings does not at all rule out non-human craft. It just makes the percentage smaller, which is what you would expect. You'd expect a smaller percentage rather than a large one. So that's not surprising. And the whole question about them not being anomalous, you can already see there's some disingenuity, because Kirkpatrick himself showed a video of that metallic sphere over Mosul, Iraq, and said that was unidentified. And that he also noted that they had been seen all over the world. So metallic spheres just don't fly around. Apparently they do. They had been observed as Foo Fighters since World War II. So this is part of the history. And I don't recall off the top of my head whether he talks about Foo Fighters from World War II in the report. That would have been important, especially if you're going to parade around a video of a metallic sphere in Iraq. So where is the explanation of what that sphere is if it's not anomalous? It looks pretty anomalous to me if it's a metallic sphere. Where are the lift surfaces? What is the propulsion device? Those are questions I'd ask as a scientist or an engineer.
Right. And one thing I've wondered, Dr. Knuth, is some people talk about the possibility, of course, of U.S. tech, but how many reports, that are clearly misidentified U.S. tech, how many of those were made by civilians versus military personnel? Because I question our own military doing tests that nobody knows about against other branches?
Well, that's a good question too, and I don't know what their procedures are, and so that's something that they may need to end up to. They may have to review internally at some point if that's what's going on. But pilots need to know what's in the air. Period. Both commercial pilots and military pilots and private pilots all need to know what is in the air. And so if you are flying test craft in populated places where there are other airplanes, that's a safety hazard, period. And if pilots are seeing things that they can't identify, that's a safety hazard. They need to be identified, and pilots need to be educated as to what they can see. And this is a big problem. It's a safety hazard, period. And for AARO just to say, well, there's nothing anomalous here, nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. Well, pilots are still seeing things, and commercial pilots are seeing things. And that means you haven't answered the question as to what they are, and you haven't done your job. And I worry about that.
Absolutely. And of course, if it was adversary tech, that would be pretty brazen, right? It seems like
yes, definitely would. Yeah. Well, the Chinese balloons are brazen. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
But because maybe it's not.
Wars are started over things like that. It's very dangerous.
Right. And of course, we shot down literally three UFOs over Super Bowl weekend, last Super Bowl. And we still don't know anything else about them. No photos, no videos, no details, nothing. Other than the insinuation that one of them was a child's pico balloon, which we actually interviewed the people involved with those pico balloons and basically proved that that was not the case. So I love this comment from Pepito GPO. Does anyone know why Skinwalker Ranch doesn't seriously dig the mesa?
That's a good question, and I think the explanation I've heard is that mesa consists of huge boulders. It is not easy you're just not digging. You're removing boulders, which is really hard to do. I would love them to dig into that mesa, but I think
that makes a lot of sense.
Difficult to do. And there may be safety concerns too. I mean, if you honestly don't know what's there, it's potentially a hazard.
And I'm glad that listener asked, because we actually have Brandon Fugel coming on the show with us in a few weeks, and we will ask him that. And I'm pretty interested to know what he says. So I'm sure he will have some good insight on that. Some more unanswered questions from the AARO Report, Dr. Knuth. It seemed to be, according to this article, littered with some puzzling breadcrumbs for, unknown, strange materials. Like they talk about how the private sector claims to have possession of material from extraterrestrial craft in the 40s or 50s, and they claim that the material has the potential to act as a terahertz. Is that what that THC stands for?
Terahertz, yep.
Terahertz frequency waveguide, and therefore could exhibit, this is pretty intriguing, anti-gravity and mass reduction properties under the appropriate conditions. But AARO concluded their science laboratory said the material is a metallic alloy, terrestrial in nature, and possibly this is intriguing, I think, of U.S. Air Force origin based on its material collection. So, interesting thing there.
Nature, yeah. So, yeah. Well, that's a good question.
I always heard that we kind of had the same chemicals and elements and such throughout our universe. So I always wondered, how can they necessarily determine if we did have extraterrestrial technology, Dr. Knuth? How would we definitively be able to say, yep, that is not from here?
And that is another difficult problem. If you had material from a crash, how would you identify that it didn't come from Earth? Everything in the universe is made up of all the same elements and all the same isotopes. Now, one way to tell that something is different, at least, would be to look at the isotope ratios. So a certain type of chemical is a chemical basically because chemistry acts using the electrons in the electron shell around the atoms. And the number of electrons equals the number of protons in the nucleus. But you can have extra neutrons, which don't have an electric charge, and that changes the mass of the atoms. So those are different isotopes. Different isotopes have different numbers of neutrons. So we know that certain chemicals on Earth, certain elements on Earth can have different isotopes. And we know on Earth naturally which isotopes occur with which proportions. So if you find a material that's been made where the isotope proportions don't match what you would expect to happen naturally on Earth, then you know that either somebody tampered with the isotopes in creating that object, or it perhaps came from somewhere else, did not come from Earth. You can't conclude, definitively that it didn't come from Earth, but you can at least conclude that it's not naturally occurring on Earth or had been somehow manipulated. So I don't know what the isotope, I don't know about any of the isotope studies for that particular material. That material was a layered piece of metal that consisted of, it was bismuth and magnesium, if I remember right. So there were nano layers of bismuth and magnesium, which is interesting because one of them is diamagnetic and the other is paramagnetic. So they have different magnetic properties. And that has been, those properties have been used in creating new types of materials that we use for, that we're now experimenting with. They're called metamaterials, and they have special properties. And this particular piece of metal that had been tested acted like a terahertz waveguide. Terahertz is a very high frequency of radiation. So it's above radio. It has a higher frequency than radio waves, higher frequency than microwaves, but it's less than infrared light. So it sits in this region between microwaves and infrared light. And in fact, the scanners at airports where you got to put your hands up, those are terahertz devices. Now, we don't have much capability to work with terahertz, electromagnetic waves in the terahertz range. That's hard to do. And we're just learning how to do that. And so for this to be a terahertz waveguide is kind of interesting, but it's hard to know what it is. And for AARO to be claiming that this is consistent with materials that have been made by the Air Force or that, well, let's see the evidence. I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical of anybody who comes to me that says they saw an alien spacecraft. I'm skeptical. But I'm also skeptical of government reports that claim things that don't provide evidence. So let's see the evidence that the Air Force is making things like this. I would like to see a mouthful there. They could, easy to blow it off saying, "Oh yeah, we make these," and then we're supposed to just believe you. Look, this is the same organization that told us that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons of mass destruction, and we're supposed to just believe them. I'm skeptical.
Yeah, if we're
and distrustful at this point. So let's see some honesty and openness, and maybe we can have a trusting relationship again.
But I think it's a healthy skepticism, and it's actually one of the foundations of science, right? Like disagreement, skepticism. If everybody just agreed with each other, the Earth would still be flat and we'd still be the center of the universe. So you have to disagree and you have to be skeptical. I think then that's what makes science continue to move on. I'm really intrigued that you said the word metamaterial, Dr. Knuth. Do you in physics, let's say before you really got into the UFO topic, did you ever use that interchangeably in physics with the word biologics?
No, I don't know. No, I don't think so.
That's come up in some chat recently with Diana Pasulka, religion expert, who I'm sure you've heard of and you may have even met.
Yeah, I know Diana.
Right, and she uses the word biologics that may have been passed on to her from the military. And I think the military, when they say the word biologics, they're kind of talking biotech, right? But that gets muddled up in all this too, right? Like trying to prove that something is extraterrestrial, or should we say from an alien or an NHI. And the fact is that, okay, if it is our tech and it's so far sufficiently advanced in what we're aware of, that would be really difficult to prove. If our tech is reverse engineered from alien technology, so it's a little bit of ours and a little bit of theirs, well, that would be very difficult to analyze as well.
Yeah, again, you wouldn't be able to prove that it came from extraterrestrial tech. You could just say that it was ours, and that would be, you're stuck again. Proving that something is extraterrestrial is extremely difficult, and I'm not sure that that's reasonable to do without a whole lot of evidence.
Absolutely. And back to this article with some unanswered questions from the AARO Report. Well, what about things just beyond our knowledge limitations? And we were just talking about this a little bit, Dr. Knuth, like parallel dimensions, traveling the speed of light, remarkable physics achievements. This all gets muddled up in there, and I know it could be quite difficult for even PhD physicists to assess.
Right. And again, it would be hard to approach any of these without seeing evidence. And I think that's the standard that science holds for things, and we have to maintain that. And this is how we make progress, and this is how we're sure of ourselves when we do make progress. And so, that the having evidence is important, and that's one thing that the AARO report is lacking. There's a lot of references to other Air Force reports, that were much less well-founded than this one even.
Right, and it really does seem to, ironically, regurgitate a lot of other information rather than passing on its own evidence, which, you thought AARO that was one of their core missions, was to gather evidence and analyze it and present it to the public. But I honestly didn't really see too much of that.
A previous, referring to a previous Air Force report is not evidence. That just shows consistency and self-consistency, which is not what we're interested in here, because the accusations are that they've been lying about this for 80 years. So let's see the actual evidence that shows that isn't the case. The one of the Air Force reports that had been, that was referred to, talked about Roswell as having been due to a mistaken identity with a saucer-shaped Mars landing craft that was being tested. And that was actually stated in 1995. The Air Force claimed that Roswell crash was actually a Mars landing craft that was being tested. Well, wait a minute. Time out. First, where's the evidence of that? They provided no evidence. They simply made a claim. And they showed a picture of one of these, back shells for one of the Mars landing crafts. That looks like a saucer. Well, all right, now I'm convinced. No, I'm not convinced, actually, because I want to see the evidence. And the bigger question is, why would the Air Force have been testing a Mars landing craft in 1947, 10 years before we ever even launched a satellite into space? Before all scientists believed that space travel was actually possible, they're claiming that they were testing a Mars landing craft? Really?
Before we even had an Air Force.
That is ridiculous, is what that is. That's just silly. And it's clear they're lying, clear they're making stuff up. And again, it makes them untrustworthy. My son, when he was little, he had this little book from the 1950s on basically, it was called How to Behave and Why. And I had actually intended to find that book and bring it here and read from it, because there's a whole chapter on lying and how when you lie, it means that no one can trust you after that. And it goes into this, explaining it to a little kid. And I think these people need to read this book, because they're just making stuff up and expecting us to believe it. a Mars landing craft in 1947? Somebody was testing that? I call
No.
BS.
It's like the little boy that cried wolf.
That's right. And then, so what does AARO do? AARO then refers to that document as a reputable source. That's even sillier. Come on, we can do better. We can do better than this. This is ridiculous.
For sure. At this point, the preponderance of their denials of things like Roswell and all the things they say that it could have been or was, it actually enhances the probability that it was an alien crash at Roswell.
Oh, exactly.
Because it's so ridiculous.
And I've said that before, because the first explanation that was given for that was put out by the Air Force itself, by the local Air Force, and they said that they captured a flying saucer. That was the first explanation. That was quashed within 24 hours. And then they said it was a weather balloon. And then they said it was, some project where they're dropping dummies from a water balloon. Well, why a weather balloon? Why are you dropping dummies from a weather balloon? And then why do you have to say that there was some saucer-shaped Mars lander? And then it's Project Mogul. Project Mogul, it turns out that the balloon that they supposedly would have had to have launched never got launched. If you look at the professor's records, who was actually running the program from NYU, if you look at those records, it was never launched. And then had it been launched, it would have had to have been launched on June 4th. And what were they doing with Project Mogul? Project Mogul was they were trying to come up with a way to detect Soviet nuclear blasts. And the trick is they had to get their equipment up to 50,000 feet. And they had problems with using balloons to get it up to 50,000 feet, because once a balloon goes up, the air pressure goes down, so the balloon gets bigger and the volume increases, which makes it even, the density go down even. So the thing keeps going up, keeps getting bigger, keeps going up, keeps getting bigger until it pops and the whole thing falls. That's what happens to these balloons. And they wanted one of these to hover at 50,000 feet. And so they were doing experiments to figure out how to do this. That's what that project was about. Super secret project, because of what they were trying to do. But is that really grounds for the hyperbolic response of the U.S. military when it was found? It had radar reflectors on it, so they should have been tracking it. So when it came down in Mac Brazel's ranch, they should have known it happened, and they should have collected it immediately, but they didn't. Nobody knew it came down there, because it was days later that he then reports it to the sheriff, that reports it to the Air Force, and then they come and collect it. And then they detain him. They detain him for 5 days for a balloon experiment. Are you kidding me? And that balloon would have been launched, according to the professor's records. That balloon would have been launched on June 4th, and wasn't because of weather. And he notes that in his records. So now what's going on? And even if it had been launched on June 4th, are you to tell me that this balloon literally hangs out over New Mexico for a month or for 3 weeks? I just flew in from California 2 days ago, and we were at 30,000 feet, and we had a 146 mile an hour tailwind at 30,000 feet. This thing's at 50,000 feet, and there's no winds at all, and the thing just hangs over Roswell, New Mexico for 3 weeks, and then falls on Mac Brazel's ranch. It's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And this is one of the things that's crazy about these prosaic explanations about, for these UFO events, is the prosaic explanations are more ridiculous than what people are claiming. It's almost more probable to believe that there was an alien spacecraft there than to believe that there was some mysterious balloon that got launched that wasn't actually launched, that then hovered over New Mexico for 3 weeks and then fell on the guy's ranch. And then nobody knew it because nobody was tracking it with the radar like they were supposed to. None of it makes sense. None of it. But you have to look at it. You can't just, but people don't. They almost depend on people. They almost rely on people not paying attention because nobody looks up to see what Project Mogul actually was and what was supposed to be happening and when the balloon was supposed to be launched. And when you do it, you realize it doesn't fit at all, which is why they have to constantly move from one explanation to another. The Air Force has given, 4 or 5 explanations for Roswell over the last 80 years. And that's because none of them hold any water. Right. And what does that lead you to believe? It means that when somebody's lying like this, it means that the first explanation was probably the correct one. The first explanation that everybody wanted to quash is probably the right one. They probably caught a flying saucer. That's the only thing you can walk away with.
Well,
of course, there's no evidence for it, but we don't have evidence for any of this stuff.
Well, there actually could be more evidence than we think. I was lucky enough to go a few weeks ago to Roswell, New Mexico. And Dr. Knuth, I had no plans, didn't know what I was going to do, but I actually ended up at the crash site. So here I am. I'm driving by myself 2 hours out to the middle of the desert. It's like a scene off Breaking Bad. And meeting some folks that I barely know and hoping they're going to get me out to the crash site. No cell service. I'm texting, trying to text friends my GPS location just in case I don't make it back, because it was that kind of environment. And there's just something very interesting and special about that location. And we were out there, Dr. Knuth, and I can attest, and I'm hopeful to talk about this on the show soon. We had a metal detector, and we found some things. And one of the things that my friend found, I can only describe as a rectangular piece of anomalous metal. That's the only way I know how to describe it. So I think that there actually is some bits and pieces of evidence out there. But of course, as we discussed earlier, that's very hard to assess. It's also very offensive and disrespectful what they're doing to our own military, right? Because we are rightfully led to believe that our military is the best and the brightest in the world. But when it comes to the UFO topic, they're made out to be the Keystone Cops of the world. And I find that very offensive. It's such a disservice to our military personnel.
Yeah, it's a disservice to our military. It's irresponsible when you consider our military pilots who aren't being told what's actually in their skies, and it's disrespectful to all the experiencers, all the people who have actually seen these things and encountered these things. We've been laughing at them for 80 years, and that's not right. They've been seeing things, and they have information, and scientists haven't been paying attention. The U.S. government pretends it doesn't happen, and I think that's really a problem.
And you know what? That is data. When I was working on my dissertation, I could have chosen 2 paths. One, the mathematical path to the dissertation, or 2, interviews and talking to people. And that is data right there. And why AARO and our military and our government never admits that, hey, this is data too, I just can't understand that. So, Dr. Knuth, if you're up for it, I would like to do a hot take with you. This would be our Area 51 Coffee Company hot take. And you can pick up your Area 51 coffee at area51coffeeco.com. And there's been some, speaking of, we talked about unknown science, and there was actually a little bit of a stir on Twitter lately from a scientist in Switzerland by the name of Dr. Astrid Sturberger, I believe, something like that. Well, she went on an episode, and this is just a little short clip, and she had this to say about some things going on in CERN.
Radionuclear research. But it is more than that, because there are lots of physicians, I know some, they're doing very strange experimentation. There are beings from portals coming in and out. It's physicists from the CERN who told me this.
They've testified to beings coming in and out of portals.
Yes. They have apparently in the bottom of the CERN this portal, this door where they are dealing with all the subatomic dimensions. They say there are 17 different dimensions of reality. That's what those physicists say. Some others say there are more dimensions, And now, when you look at what is going on in the CERN, there is a fight from some of the military agencies. Intel, they say that there is a fight on time. They're trying to change time.
I am just fascinated by that, and I know you may not have much to say on that, but this is just a hot take. Dr. Knuth, CERN, a lot of people think there's strange things going on there. And of course, this is right in your wheelhouse in terms of physics. And what's your hot take on strange things at
What's
CERN?
my hot take on it? Well, these things are hard. I've not heard about anything like this. And again, I'm going to be that skeptical scientist. I'm skeptical, so I see some evidence. And if I'm going to hold that standard for all the work I do, and I'm going to hold that same standard for AARO, I'm going to have to hold it for this scientist as well. We need to see some evidence that this is happening. It's hard to imagine, but a lot of these things are hard to imagine, and that doesn't mean it's not true. So that's
right, and it certainly is.
The way I typically handle it is I treat it as interesting, and I file it away in a place where it's accessible in my mind, so that if I see something else that is commensurate with that or supports that or anything, I can then pull that back and say, oh yes, and this is like what Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger was talking about CERN, and then I will then look at it further. But make a mental note of it, and I think that's that's how I typically handle these things.
That's a good way to
see some evidence. I'd love to see some evidence. That would be fantastic.
Yes, for sure. And one of the mysteries to me, and I think that you could put yourself in this position, Dr. Knuth, if you had, I'm sure you have some friends that you respect a lot, probably some friends that academically are held in very high regard around the world. And if they came to you one day and they said, oh, you know what, I've got some friends that they told me that this happened, how would you take that?
Well, I mean, I don't disbelieve them again, but I am skeptical. So I would just make a mental note of it, and especially if it's a friend I trust, and if they had a personal experience with it, I would, of course, I'd hold that in higher regard. But
right, because
I don't just disbelieve people. I think that's silly too. You don't believe people and disbelieve people based on whether what they say makes sense to you. That's not how it works.
It's certainly not how loyalty and friendship.
We spend all day long. We spend all day long listening to anecdotes from people and believing them all day, and don't have any problems with it. But when it's a little weird, we then all of a sudden, well, you can't believe what people tell you. Well, I mean, you do all day long, and you couldn't function if you didn't. And so I think it's important to listen to people, and it's important to take note of that.
Right. And speaking of weird and mind-bending, Dr. Knuth, I have to know, it's my understanding that you have watched some of the episodes of Three Body Problem on Netflix. What's your initial hot take on Three Body Problem?
I've read about half of the first book, and I've watched about half of the episodes, so that I think I'm about in the same place in both. Oh, I'm loving it. It's great fun. Yeah, it's an excellent story, and there's a lot that I like about it. It's a good thinking story, and a lot to think about. And especially,
we'll have to be careful to be spoiler free.
Yeah, I don't want to say any spoilers, but there's a lot to think about in watching the story, and there's, and a good story makes you think about yourself as much as that you are thinking about other things. And so I'm trying to think if there's a way to say something without having a spoiler. The fact that we humans are have so much trouble getting along with each other, and makes it and are basically almost irredeemable in some sense, makes it incredibly difficult for others to trust us as well. We have a lot of problems, and that really comes through in this story. In fact, so far what I've seen is it's more about us than it is about anybody else.
Right. And I think I'm one episode ahead of you, Dr. Knuth, so this is not a spoiler, but it also teaches us to be careful what we wish for. So I will say we have to be careful sometimes about reaching out. So yeah, 3-body problem, it's mind-bending. I really recommend it for everybody to check it out. And back to this AARO report here. The AARO report, according to Micah Hanks with the debrief, and several others, by the way, was also just laden with blatant errors and all
you
kinds
get a number of them
errors.
there. I see you've got a good number of them there. That's right.
Yeah, and which is why I said in part, because this is not
God.
all the errors. And where do we start? The first one to me is one of the most egregious, because Dr. Knuth, if you had a student write a paper, you might count off points for this. I'm not 100% sure, but they.
The first two errors you have especially are especially mind blowing. You don't get the state that a senator's from right, really, in a federal report, really. How do you pull that off and keep your job? I don't know.
Doesn't that just seem sloppy? Would you agree with me that this basically invalidates things?
Exactly. It shows that it's sloppy. It's poorly done. You can't even get the simple stuff right. You can Google Harry Reid and find out that he's from Nevada. You can, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, I checked on Wikipedia. They have the correct date on Wikipedia. But he said June 23rd in the AARO report. Go to Wikipedia. It's June 24th. And then you can verify that. It is June 24th. An 8th grader would have gotten it right. So how can you hold anything to high regard when you have mistakes like this? I've been a scientific journal editor for 12 years now, actually, I think 13. And if I saw a scientific paper that had these mistakes in it, I'd reject it flat out. It would be rejected. And that's really pretty ironic, considering that the AARO report actually states that there have been no academic suggestions that these things are extraterrestrial or non-human. And when that's entirely wrong, because I did that in my paper, and that was peer-reviewed scientific paper. And so it's ironic that they're holding, scientific standards to such high regard and academic standards to such high regard, but this report doesn't even meet those standards. Doesn't come anywhere near.
Right. Another thing they did, they sort of mixed up Project Bear versus Project Stork, and they appear to misconstrue the percentage of quality sightings that remain unexplained. They referred to former director of Project Blue Book Tuskegee Airman Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jones Friend as Roger J. Friend.
Yeah.
Again, that's just sloppy.
What's going to happen? This is an opportunity, actually, in some ways, because what's going to happen is that some of us from the academic community who have been studying UFOs now for several years are going to write our own reports and correct these mistakes and provide much more information, correct information. This is going to get corrected and corrected by the people who've been studying this. And so I see this. So rather than being depressed about this, I see this as an opportunity. But
is that a teaser?
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a bit of a teaser. Yep.
Good. Because I heard you were working on a paper due out sometime next year.
Yeah, I'll contribute to some degree. I don't have time to do a whole report like this. I wish the Pentagon would have paid me to do it. I'd have done a much better job. I'd have at least gotten the first two right.
Yeah, You know what?
Look,
I mean, I think a teamwork collaboration situation on a citizen report, a citizen scientist academic report, is all the better.
and I think that's what you're gonna see, and you're gonna see it come from multiple groups. Multiple groups are gonna do this, and some are gonna work together, some are gonna do it separately. But that's what's going to happen, and I think that's going to be a positive thing that comes out of this. But the first two mistakes right there show you can't trust any of it. That's what basically says. You can't have I tell my students this all the time when they're presenting scientific talks. I said, you make any mistake in your slides, and then nobody's going to believe anything that's in your report. There's no reason to believe it, because if you can't get a simple thing right, you certainly can't get a complicated thing right. And so the AARO report is really useless and really pointless. And it's in some ways, I'm also grateful because it allows us to say that, and it's showing its true colors blatantly, which is a good thing. We know that they didn't do their job. I mean, Kirkpatrick didn't write this himself, but he did sign off on it. And I'm sorry, when you're a co-author, you need to read the report and you need to perform due diligence and make sure that it's done correctly. And he didn't.
And he's certainly familiar with academic rigor. He's written academic papers.
I'm sorry, what?
I was saying Kirkpatrick is certainly familiar with academic rigor. He's written academic papers. He should know how to assess.
He ought to be. Yeah, he ought to have. I don't think his heart was in this job at all. He was not. I don't think that he was interested in it at all. And very much like what happened with the Condon Committee, where they did a half-beat job on it as well, where they couldn't explain, a large percentage, large, I mean, more than 5% of the cases, and then said, well, there's nothing to see here. I mean, clearly they're not doing their jobs there. And this is standard, and this is what's been going on for 80 years. And right. This has been the trick that's been used, is that you just have to have some official report that says that it's nonsense, and then half the people believe that it's nonsense.
And the same trick has been used over and over again, right?
It's been used over and over, and this you can go through the Condon report and find all sorts of problems with that too, and it's ridiculous. It doesn't take a lot of work to cover this up, because most people don't want to believe it in the first place, and so all you got to do is plant a seed of doubt, and an official report is enough seed of doubt to just throw everybody off.
Right, and like we said earlier, it appeared that they simply regurgitated findings or conclusions from past studies, many of which themselves were already flawed. There's also seems to be a tendency in the AARO paper to pull the data, how convenient, that supports the AARO position and leave out the data that might argue against it. That's from someone you may know, named Robert Powell of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned Robert Powell, because he's with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. I loved his assessment of this, by the way. I thought it was dead on. Robert's a good guy, and he knows what he's doing. And in fact, the one thing that is barely touched on in this report, I don't even know if it's mentioned. I didn't see it. Are the incursions at nuclear weapon sites and nuclear facilities. Nothing. That's a national security issue that somebody ought to be saying something about. Now, if you go to the SCU website, so this is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. They have published. They put out a paper. Ian Porritt, Larry Hancock, and Sean Grosvenor put out a paper called UAP Pattern Recognition Study, 1945 to 1975, U.S. Military Atomic Warfare Complex, where they basically I'll read the first sentence. They provides a view of the pattern of reported unidentified aerospace phenomena in the United States associated with the military atomic weapons complex between 1945 and 1975. So they published this paper last year. It's 63 pages long. 63 pages long. How long is the AARO report?
12, maybe. It's not that long.
Right. How long is the AARO report? I've got here. Oh my God! I have to actually go to the end to see how many pages. So that's actually 63 pages. So are they actually the same length, or did I mix up the numbers? Now I've got to actually check.
No, I don't think the AARO report is 63 pages.
I looked at the other one. I looked at the wrong one. Sorry. Oh wait, no. The AARO report I have here is. Yeah, I have here that it's 63 pages, and the nuclear weapons study is also 63 pages. They're both 63 pages long.
Yeah,
That's
you're
interesting. Right. That's surprising. Interesting coincidence. So you've got, on one hand, you've got the SCU put out a paper on UFO incursions at nuclear weapons sites that's 63 pages long, the same length as the entire AARO report, which is supposed to cover the whole history, volume 1 of the history, right? What's wrong with this picture?
Yeah, you get the sense.
Is again lacking, severely lacking.
Sure. You get the sense, and this is one of our favorite quotes. We use it all the time from Colonel Moultrie, who did this and said this quote in front of Congress right here. You get this sense. You get the sense people are talking about it, but it's always for closed session, right? Like it's not for the public, it's not for the citizens. So they have to be talking about it, right? This nuclear affinity, it just seems like such an important part. And I believe the first time we had you on our show, you talked about one of your earlier professors got you interested in the UFO topic, telling about nuclear incursions.
I heard about that in 1988 when I started graduate school at Montana State University. One of our physics professors told us about the fact that at Malmstrom Air Force Base in northern Montana, they were having problems, present tense, with UFO incursions on the ICBM missile sites where they were shutting down ICBM missiles. So I heard about that from a physics professor. And later learned, 30 years later, learned that Robert Salas was at Malmstrom Air Force Base, the same base, in 1967, 66 and 67, and they were having problems then, the same types of problems. I also later learned, just last year went down to visit our family for Mardi Gras in Louisiana, and learned that from my wife's uncle Matt had been stationed at Malmstrom in the early 70s, and he knew all about the UFO incursions shutting down ICBM missile sites.
That's
so
amazing.
this, in some sense, this is common knowledge among certain groups of people, but not important enough for the AARO report. There's something wrong here. There's a big thing. There's some big things wrong here, and you really can't help but worry.
For sure, and it's like we said, it appears they simply chose studies that supported their position. Meanwhile, they completely ignored other studies which would have turned this on its head. Studies like one you may have heard of, Dr. Knuth, estimating flight characteristics of anomalous unidentified aerial vehicles, which had shocking physics in it. And you talked about this with us before, the fact that, we had speeds estimated at 45,000 miles per hour. And of course, this means, hey, these things actually probably could do interstellar travel if they could achieve such speeds.
Now, this leads to another problem with the AARO report and with AARO altogether, is that I published this paper, and Robert Powell and Peter Reale are co-authors. They're both from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. We published this paper, and last February briefed AARO, our UAPX team briefed AARO, and they knew of this paper. They had a copy of it. They knew about it. and this was actually on one of our slides. He then was questioned by Senator Gillibrand the next, what would that have been, March of last year, as to whether there had been any academic peer-reviewed papers published suggesting that these things were extraterrestrial, and he said no. And in fact, it says that in the AARO Report. He says that in the beginning of one of the sections. Let me find this. This is section 2, I believe, on page 13, or no, section 2, page 7, section 2. So we can go to page 7, section 2. Executive summary: AARO found no evidence that any USG investigation, academic sponsored research, that's my paper, or official panel review has confirmed any sighting of a UAP represented extraterrestrial technology. So they are denying the existence of this paper, which is problematic because, heck, the Israelis know about this paper. So so I can point you to the report written by Frank Milburn titled "The Pentagon's UAP Task Force," written for BISA, which is the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan University, Israel. And in this paper, they actually quote my paper. And I will read the paragraph. I'll read the paragraph from my paper in the Israeli report to highlight the fact that the Israelis know this and have discussed it. So they say one scientific study, quote, estimating flight characteristics of anomalous unidentified aerial vehicles, notes, and this is what I said in the paper, estimated accelerations range from almost 100 G to thousands of Gs with no observed air disturbance, no sonic booms, and no evidence of excessive heat commensurate with even the minimal estimated energies. ... In many cases, the number and quality of witnesses and the equipment used to track and record the craft favor the latter hypothesis that these are indeed technologically advanced craft. The observed flight characteristics are consistent with the flight characteristics required for interstellar travel. If these observed accelerations were sustainable in space, then these craft could easily reach relativistic speeds within a matter of minutes to hours and cover interstellar distances in a matter of days to weeks, proper time. So that is a quote from my paper, a peer-reviewed scientific paper that assesses UAP speeds. That was quoted in an Israeli military think tank report. But AARO makes no mention of this, and this in fact states that no papers of such type exist.
This is what's so frustrating. Your paper is a clear repudiation of prosaic explanations, but the AARO report insinuates that it's all prosaic explanations.
And the AARO report denies that paper exists. Explicitly states that it doesn't. So we have another big problem. And in fact, what the AARO report also doesn't cover is the talk given by Herman Oberth. Herman Oberth is a rocketry pioneer. He was mentor to Wernher von Braun. In 1954, Herman Oberth gave a talk on flying saucers. And in that talk, he notes that they had been tracked on radar, reaching speeds up to 19 kilometers a second, which is about 42,000 miles an hour, which is not that different than what I'm computing here. That was noted by Herman Oberth in 1954, public talk. And he then goes on to state that had it just been one or two radar observations, he would hold off until more data were collected before believing that. But he had seen up to, or at least 50 radar observations of UAP that support that fact. So this was well known by some people in 1954, that these things were traveling at spacecraft speeds, 40,000 miles an hour. That's the speed of the New Horizons probe that passed Pluto and is currently in the outer solar system. The space shuttle and space station only go like 17,000 miles an hour, only half of that. So UAPs have been tracked going faster than our space station and noted by Hermann Oberth in 1954 with over 50 radar observations. Why aren't any of these in the AARO report? Why is this not noted? 1954. Do you know what the airspeed record was in 1954? I don't know the exact number. It's around 700 miles an hour.
Right.
Certainly not 40,000 miles an hour. Give me a break. It's obvious what's going on. And this is a whitewash. It's ridiculous.
Yes, I think this would be a good time, Dr. Knuth, to get your reaction to an interview. Well, there was an interview Dr. Kirkpatrick did shortly after the release of the AARO report, where he specifically talks about the Nimitz encounter. And I think it's very interesting what he said.
I testified multiple times on the fact that Tic Tac, there's some great eyewitness accounts of what is described as the Tic Tac. What was lacking is data, right? So I worked with one of the pilots to try to tease out a little bit more of what exactly was it that we were potentially witnessing, and by the descriptions of everything from water disturbance to motion, relative motion, and how you can maybe see what you're seeing. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is, I think that one, my opinion is that one is going to remain unresolved because there is no data. There is no radar data. Allegations of, the secret black helicopter that came and picked up the tapes, none of that happened. There's no evidence that somebody pulled the tapes off. What does happen, and this is why we had to change the data retention policy, was all of these platforms have fixed storage or a fixed amount of storage, and they only retain the data for any given mission, maybe a day, unless there is a problem with the platform that they use the data for diagnostics for. And then the next time that platform goes out, the data is overwritten. So there's no conspiracy in that. That's just how the military operates with these data tapes and whatnot. So we did write new policy that said, hey, look, if you're reporting a UAP, you have to save all of that data and transmit it to AARO within some period of time. So I think the Tic Tac is so far back in time, there's no data, and we went and looked for all the data. But the other thing that I asked around a bit, which I don't know, it certainly hadn't been answered by the time I left, was, there wasn't a lot of asking or questioning of other activities that might have been going on at the time, either naval activities or adversary activities. And both of those needed to be explored at that time, because records of when tests, for example, were done that far back in time may not be accurate or exist, and records of any adversary activity, will be hard to track down for exact date and time stamps, right? And those are the kinds.
That's courtesy of Mike Colangelo on Twitter. Dr. Knuth, what's your reaction to Dr. Kirkpatrick there?
It's hard to disagree with a lot of that. It's, I think his statement that the black helicopter that took all the data is, and that just saying that didn't happen, I think is extremely questionable, considering that people on the Nimitz said it happened. and I know some of these people, and some of those people had something to do with the data. So they said, I mean, there is no data, so yeah, that's the problem. There's no data. And whether the data was taken, whether it was on a short-term storage, at this point, it doesn't matter. There's no data. So we have to, you either take the word of the radar operator in describing what he saw, and that would be Senior Chief Kevin Day or Gary Voorhees, who worked with the Spy-1 radar system and worked on the reconstructions of what happened and described what they saw. I trust them, and I trust what they describe. And I trust Fravor when he says that this thing shot off like a bullet out of a gun. Was gone within 2 seconds. We did the calculation on how fast it would have had to accelerate for that to happen as well. And in all the cases that we looked at, the verbal description from Kevin Day about the objects dropping from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds, the object disappearing from view in less than 2 seconds from Fravor, and the actual video, all of them showed abnormally high accelerations. So I don't think that's
why do they ignore qualitative data, Dr. Knuth?
Well, I mean, he's a physicist, and physicists want hard data, and that's.
And by qualitative, can I explain what I mean by qualitative? I mean quantitative data would be numbers, right? Mathematics,
right?
Data collection in terms of mode, mean, median, those sorts of things. But qualitative data.
Well, I don't think you can ignore it. I think he's choosing to ignore it. That's the problem.
Right. And the qualitative data.
I mean, the data also exists. The data also exists for the Japanese airline case, JAL 1628, and Dr. Daniel Kumbe, who was at the Niels Bohr Institute, analyzed that in detail. In my paper, we only analyzed the summary of what was described. Daniel Kumbe took it a step further, actually got the radar data and analyzed that, and found accelerations of the large walnut-shaped craft, which was described by the pilot to be 3 747s in length, which is about the size of an aircraft carrier. Dr. Kumbe found that thing was several instances accelerating up to 9,000 Gs with the top speed of 250,000 miles an hour. The 250,000 miles an hour will that can get you to the moon in about 50 minutes. 50 minutes. You could go to the moon and have lunch and come back easily. And at those speeds and accelerations. At some point you don't know what to say anymore. And we're going to ignore Hermann Oberth's claim about these things moving at 19 kilometers a second back in 1954. He said there were at least 50 radar records of that. Where are all these records? I mean, who has them? That's an important question.
Right. One thing that disturbs me about what Dr. Kirkpatrick said in regards to the Nimitz is it completely ignores the intimidation and the trauma that we heard about with folks like Kevin Day and others involved in this incident. And of course, if this was just some sort of prosaic explanation, none of that would make sense. Why would there be the need for this intimidation? Why would it be so traumatizing for the individuals involved?
It all gets hard to explain, right? If you're just going to believe the Pentagon and AARO, then it gets hard to explain.
Right. Absolutely. And
I think the prosaic explanation here is that they are not telling the truth.
Right. Again,
they're either not telling the truth or purposefully or just trying not to do their jobs. And I think that's a problem.
Well, I think one thing they've clearly done is these cases that are obviously anomalous, obviously not prosaic, and there's evidence for it. Hey, they've just ignored it, right? Like what easier way to write it off than just to not address it? The elephant in the room,
when,
if you will.
when 97% of the cases are clearly, easily explained, and you focus on 5% of those and talk about them, and you ignore that other 3%, yeah, it all looks silly. Exactly.
Well, Dr. Knuth, I tell you one thing that you did recently that drew a lot of great praise was your presentation at the Soul Foundation meeting.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I mean, I watched the video again today. I think I saw 127,000 views of your presentation.
My God.
You had no idea.
That's a lot.
That's on YouTube. And three things that really caught my attention was your discussion of USOs and that fact that one of your friends is working on a handheld nuclear reactor to lure USOs and maybe UFOs. And perhaps you have some field expeditions in the works, and maybe you already alluded to a paper coming up.
Right. Yeah, I did talk about USOs, and I have a little more information about that case from New Zealand that I'm now looking at in some detail. I mentioned that my colleague was working toward designing a new type of nuclear reactor, which he's now done some tests, and it actually works. This big, pretty cool. But
wow.
But we don't really have plans. It was inspired by
Ghostbusters.
It was inspired by an idea at lunch where it would be cool to use a nuclear reactor to try to lure in UFOs. It would not be safe to do this. You can't just run around with a nuclear reactor. I'm a professional physicist, and I know better, and he knows better, and he's designed this. Matthew Shadagas has designed this, and under with the university's approval, and he's followed all the safety procedures, and
I'm picturing Bill Murray with a proton.
He's done a very nice job, very professional, and he's getting it patented. So it's a big deal. It's a really cool invention, and I wish him the best in getting it all working.
Are you going to volunteer to use one?
I'm sorry?
Are you going to volunteer to use one of these handheld nuclear reactors?
To use it? I would love to use one if I could. I mean, the one that's this big, I think, could conceivably power a house for 1 million years. So, I mean, these things this is very possibly transformative. It's a big deal.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, and then let's see, field expeditions. Yeah, I'd love to do more field expeditions. I recently went to visit the Tedesco brothers, who are working on Long Island. They put a book out on Amazon called Nightcrawler about some of their studies of UAPs off the coast of Long Island. And I went observing for 2 nights with them about 2 weeks ago, which was great fun. I got to see their equipment, and we talked about equipment, and we didn't see anything, of course, but because you never do, right? It's actually hard to. It takes some persistence, and they have a lot of energy and a lot of persistence, and I got to give them a lot of credit for that. That's pretty fantastic. I got to see some of their videos that they've taken, and some of them are really interesting and compelling. So they have collected some data, and we've talked about working together to some degree and collecting more. So I think I'd love to get some more of my equipment together and go back out with them and do some more observing this spring. That would be great fun.
That does sound great. And Dr. Knuth, we had just a couple listener questions here for you.
Sure.
And Eli wants to know, Jacques Vallée theorizes UAPs could be traveling interdimensionally. Perhaps UAPs might give the scientific community the opportunity to test those advanced theories.
Yes, that has been proposed. I'm not quite sure what it means to be interdimensional, and there are different ways to look at that. The theoretical work that I've done suggests that there are 3 dimensions, and that's it, period. And I have a hard time visualizing other dimensions, although there can be other ways to do things other than additional dimensions. And the multiverse is just one example. But so, yeah, I mean, UAPs, if we could collect some good data on them, we might learn. I mean, there's a great number of things that we can probably learn from these objects, and I would very much like to do so.
Definitely. And Dr. Knuth, we have one more listener question here. And this has caused quite a stir on Twitter here recently. This is from another academic. Perhaps you've heard of this. Any thoughts on Professor Simon Holland, who recently stated that he is aware that we have received pictures of other life forms in 2019 via SETI?
That I don't know anything about. I'll have to look into that. Thank you for informing me. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
Yeah, I will tell you, and by the way, it's very intriguing, right? The intersection.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to put that into my browser right now so I don't lose it. Because I'll get off of this, and then I'll forget the person's name, and then I will be lost. I'll have to wait until you put this out on. Right.
And he's a cool guy, Professor Simon Holland, and what's intriguing is how what he has said, and this lady, talking about CERN, and this has all started coming out at the same time as Three-Body Problem on Netflix, and it's just very interesting, right? Diana Pasulka talks a lot about this intersection of the media and ufology, and I have a listener question for you, Dr. Knuth. A very interesting phenomenon has started taking place, and that is academics and scientists. They have kind of started becoming characters, larger than life characters in ufology. Diana Pasulka is in talks with the producers of Game of Thrones to make a television show about her books, American Cosmics. One of the major characters in that is Dr. Gary Nolan with Stanford. Some people think this might be kind of a dangerous proposition, the intersection of fame and becoming sort of larger than life personalities and celebrities, actually. What's your thoughts on that? Because you might be on the show too.
Yeah, those are real concerns. I worry about that myself. Especially after doing the Netflix's Encounters show. I was on episode 3, and I think it turned out very nicely. I'm really happy about it. And
your part was the best part.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
That's true.
I just hope that one person who hasn't watched my Soul presentation 127,000 times doesn't decide to watch it 127,000 times. But I do worry about. And I have filmed for other shows now that will be coming out in the next year. But I do worry about that when I'm on TV, and I. As a physicist, I'm very much an introvert, so it's hard for me to do the television shows, and I find that difficult. I joke. There's always the joke on how do you identify the extroverted physicist. He's the guy looking at the other person's shoes when talking to someone. So I feel that acutely, and I think that's difficult because it, depending on the shows and the way that we're portrayed in the shows, that can really affect our credibility in the scientific community, I think, and I worry about that. I worked hard in my career and have a lot of credibility, but I don't want to blow it being on a silly TV show if I'm not careful. So I think it's a worrisome thing, but it can be helpful too, because people do need to hear what some of us scientists are thinking about and doing. And science is very bad at communicating anything, basically. So, and so having better science communicators is an important thing. And many of the more popular past science communicators really fall short when it comes to this UAP topic. They're somehow UFOs get mentioned and their brains go out the window, and they say silly things. And I think that it's important to talk, frankly and seriously about this topic. It's an important topic, and it's important for a lot of reasons. This is potentially a national security issue. It's actually a global security issue. These things aren't just natural. There's a global security issue. There's a safety issue when it comes to pilots. And you don't want one of these objects to come flying at the windscreen of a passenger jet when you've got a pilot, with 250 people in the back who are just trying to get home. You know how hard it is. Air travel is hard enough the way it is. I wouldn't want to have to deal with that. And then there are people who encounter these things, who see these things, who aren't, who can't really, who have this fantastic experience and can't really share it without being made fun of. That's hard. And then there is the whole abduction phenomenon, which is not clear that that's nonsense either. I know several people now who have claimed to have been abducted, and it sounds entirely possible. I believe them, and I think that that's an issue too. And so then there are, and some of these people have these experiences have been traumatic and have had a huge effect on them in their lives. And to not be believed and not be able to share those experiences with others is really criminal. It's hard. So I'd like to support those people too. And I think I can do that by talking seriously about the topic. And I think that, let's look at the topic. Let's collect data. Let's be skeptical and be careful. And let's see what we can find out. But to just, to write a report and make 8th grade level mistakes and, and then just say there's nothing to see here. It's all nonsense. And there's this culture of nonsense that's been perpetuated, I think, is really unfair.
Right. And that's very well said. And part of me has to wonder, Dr. Knuth, if what you're talking about with the abductions, it's a natural extension of the fact that there is a phenomenon. Then you naturally extend to something is in control of them. And then you naturally extend to things like, what do they want? And what are they doing? What are they doing we don't know about? And part of me wonders if this is perhaps part of the reason why we're being so coy, or why we're having such a hard time finding out about things.
Well, there's a lot of questions there that come into play. If you were to take the non-human intelligence hypothesis and run with it a little bit, then the idea that they do interact with people at some level, perhaps abductions, is not improbable. I mean, would make some kind of sense. And then, but then you have to start worrying about what their hello, Julie. Then you have to start worrying about what the implications are and what their intentions are. And that becomes really difficult. And I think that if they are operating, we don't know to what level they interact with humanity and what their intentions are, and are they able to control people's perceptions or desires to study this or desires to cover it up to some degree. I mean, what is the involvement here? What are the interactions? And I think that this whole topic, if the non-human aspects do turn out to be correct, then there's a whole other kettle of fish to worry about.
That's for sure. Shout out to our friends in Australia, UFO.
Australia, hello.
That UFO show. Hello, they say hello, beautiful people. Much love from.
You guys are up early. Thank you.
Australia. That's right. There we have more than one group of listeners from Australia, and they are fantastic, and they're really into the phenomenon out there. And what I like about them is they seem to really be into old school, going out in the field and watching the sky. Like that's what they're into, and I think that is one of the keys, honestly, of how well that's how just an ordinary citizen can contribute, in my opinion.
I think we can collect our own data. This is what we're trying to do at UAPX, and my friends and colleagues are trying to do at in the Galileo project and the IFEX project in Würzburg, Germany, with Professor Hakan Kayal, and Beatrix Villarroel in the Vasco project. Well, she's looking at old data, old telescope imagery. But I think that, we can collect our own data and we can learn some things. Wow, and it's actually in the early afternoon, and I guess it's late here. I guess it's 11 p.m. here in New York. So, yeah, it would be. I lost track of time. I flew in from California yesterday, so I'm still jet lagged. I have no idea what time it is. I was in Big Sur, and the highway collapsed, and they had to evacuate us. We had to head out by half of the highway washed into the sea down the cliff, and then we had to be evacuated by convoy. It was quite exciting. Yeah.
Mudslide?
No, I don't know what caused it. Yeah, there was a landslide, but part of the highway cut along the cliff and had supports under it. And then, but that whole lane fell into the ocean. And then they closed off the highway, and they had a convoy. They had assessed the safety, and they had a convoy head north to get out of the Big Sur area by just driving in that lane. But it was all well controlled, so nobody else went into the ocean.
I'm glad you made it back safe and sound for tonight,
you.
Dr. Knuth, and you've got a lot of great research ahead of you. And we're so happy to have you with us tonight at All Things Unexplained. Shout out to Smitty, who couldn't join us tonight. Shout out to CJ, who could not join us tonight. CJ.
Yeah, I'm sorry CJ couldn't join us. Hello, CJ. We missed you.
I know, and she really hated that. And she grew up in California, in Palmdale. As a matter of fact, we had an episode where she sang some songs by Palmdale's most famous resident, Afro Man. I'll have to pull those up for you sometime. I think you would appreciate them. And CJ and I are both in Central North Carolina now. We really appreciate everybody that tuned in tonight. Thanks so much for Dr. Knuth for joining us. One thing all our listeners
thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. You're so kind and generous with your time, and we really appreciate it. One thing our listeners can do is subscribe to the channel, comment, like, and share. It really helps us defeat the evil algorithms that try to keep us away from disclosure and away from the truth. Dr. Knuth, do you have any final thoughts for tonight?
Be skeptical. Be equally skeptical of people who tell you fantastical things as you, and be that same skepticism should be directed toward, Kirkpatrick and AARO and others. They need to provide evidence too. We need evidence. We need evidence because we need to figure out what's going on for real and get past this. So like as you were describing, the people in Australia collecting, data from the skies, do it, please. Yeah, collect information, multiple cameras simultaneously so you can triangulate. Let's find out what's going on, and I'm convinced that once we get several scientific groups out there collecting data, it won't take us more than 20 years to figure out what's going on.
Yes.
We can solve this. This is solvable. It's knowable. It's understandable.
I'm totally with you. There is a truth out there. I think we can get to it. I think it's folks like you that are really driving that, and we really appreciate you. You're putting in work. You're getting out in the field. You're doing legitimate science, and you are progressing the field of science and the academic study of UFOs, and we really appreciate you. I am Dr. Mounce. And thanks everybody for tuning in to All Things Unexplained tonight. Thanks to all our listeners. Hi again to Julie, Eli, all our fans in Australia. Thank you so much for tuning in. Shout out to Smitty and CJ who couldn't be with us tonight. my final thought for tonight, there was a time not that long ago where everyone thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. And if it hadn't been for some dedicated scientists back in the day, not that long ago, like Dr. Knuth, who really pushed science forward, despite the beliefs of everyone around them, despite what their officials told them to believe. It took some dedicated folks like Dr. Knuth to really push science forward, and we continue to do so. And we really appreciate you, Dr. Knuth. The truth is still out there, folks. Get off your phones, get off your screens, get out in the woods, look at the skies, and you might be amazed. You might just find more than UFOs. As someone told us recently, you might find a little bit more of yourself out there. Thanks, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, support. What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, will save for closed session.